It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Is that a knockoff? Beatrice Vane sneered, fingering Elias Thorne's collar in front of the morning rush of customers. She didn't wait for an answer, her lip curling as she pulled her hand away as if his cheap cotton blend might stain her French manicure. The bakery, the gilded crust, was thick with the cloying, buttery scent of expensive vanilla and the sharp, metallic tang of the high-end espresso machine. It was a space designed for the elite, all white marble and gold leaf, and in the center of it, Elias stood like a gray smudge on a masterpiece. "It's just a shirt, Beatrice," he said, his voice level. He didn't flinch, though he could feel the eyes of the local socialites burning into his back. He was used to being the invisible man, the boring brother-in-law who spent his days buried in spreadsheets as a senior forensic auditor. "It's an eyesore," she snapped, turning her back to him to adjust a display of gold-flecked macarons. "And it's bad for branding. People come here for excellence, not to be reminded that the lower middle class exists. Why are you even here? I told you the order wouldn't be ready until noon." "I'm not here for the pastries. I'm here for Sophie," he replied. He glanced toward the swinging kitchen doors. Through the circular glass window, he could see his 14-year-old daughter. Sophie Thorne looked pale, her hair sticking to her forehead as she hauled a heavy crate of flour across the slick tile floor. Beatrice laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that lacked any warmth. "She's working. You know, that thing people do to earn their keep. Since you clearly can't provide the lifestyle she craves, I'm doing her a favor. I'm teaching her the value of $1. She's 14, Beatrice, and she's been here since 5 in the morning. It's Saturday," he said, his pulse beginning to thrum in his neck. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the cool, brushed metal of his phone. He didn't pull it out, not yet. "She's family," Beatrice said, finally turning around. She leaned against the marble counter, her designer apron cinched tight over a silk dress that cost more than Elia's monthly mortgage. "And family helps out. Or are you going to pay me back for that loan I gave you for her dental work 3 years ago? I didn't think so." The bell above the door chimed, a bright, aggressive sound. Cassandra Vane drifted in, draped in a pashmina that screamed old money, followed closely by Juliana Sterling. The air in the room shifted instantly, growing colder and more performative. "Oh, look," Cassandra said, her eyes skipping over Elias as if he were a piece of furniture. "The auditor is back, checking the tax on flour, Elias, or just hovering." Juliana Sterling offered a tight, pitying smile. "Beatrice, darling, the window display is divine, but who is this?" Beatrice sighed dramatically, waving a hand toward Elias. "My brother-in-law. He's a bit of a permanent fixture in the struggling category. He was just leaving." She turned her gaze to the kitchen and raised her voice. "Sophie, stop dawdling and get out here. Mrs. Sterling needs her custom order boxed, and the floor in the prep area is a disgrace." Sophie emerged a moment later, her shoulders hunched. She was wearing an oversized apron stained with berry filling. As she reached for a box, Elias noticed the clumsy white bandage wrapped around her thumb. "What happened to your hand, Sophie?" Elias asked, stepping forward. "It's nothing, Dad," she whispered, not looking up. "She tripped over her own feet," Beatrice interrupted, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness for Juliana's benefit. "The girl is as clumsy as her father. Honestly, Juliana, it's a struggle to get decent help these days, even when you're doing a charity case for your own kin." Elias felt a cold, familiar stillness settle over him. It was the same feeling he got when he found a hidden offshore account or a double entry ledger. The world stopped being a mess of emotions and became a series of data points. He looked at the cash register, noticing the small, training mode, light blinking at the bottom of the screen, a common trick for business owners looking to hide cash sales from the IRS. He looked at the labor law poster hidden behind a stack of empty boxes in the corner, its text obscured. "She's bleeding through the bandage, Beatrice," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. "Then she can put on a glove," Beatrice snapped, the mask slipping as she glared at him. "Juliana doesn't have all day. Either buy something or get out. You're blocking the flow of actual commerce." Cassandra chuckled, tapping her chin with a manicured nail. "Really, Elias, Go back to your little cubicle and leave the business to the people who actually know how to run one. You're embarrassing yourself." Elias looked at Sophie, who was biting her lip, trying to blink away tears of exhaustion and pain. He looked at Beatrice, who was currently basking in the admiring gaze of Juliana Sterling, acting the part of the successful, benevolent entrepreneur. "You're right," Elias said, his voice remarkably calm. "I should leave." He walked toward the counter, leaning in just close enough for Beatrice to smell the lack of expensive cologne on him. Her nose wrinkled in anticipation of another plea, another apology. "I noticed you're still using the 4 version of the point-of-sale software," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers. "It has a very specific glitch in the audit trail. You should probably have someone look at that before someone else does." Beatrice blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Get out of my store." Elias didn't answer. He turned to Sophie and reached out, gently taking the heavy box from her hands and setting it on the counter. "Go get your things, Sophie. We're going to the doctor." "She stays until the shift is over," Beatrice shouted, her voice cracking the elegant atmosphere of the bakery. Elias paused at the door, the brass bell silhouetted against the morning sun. He didn't look back at the rage reddening Beatrice's face or the confused stares of the socialites. He simply checked his watch. "The shift is over, Beatrice," he said quietly. "In fact, you have no idea just how over it is." He stepped out into the bright light of the sidewalk, his mind already spinning through the contact list on his phone. He stopped at a name he hadn't called in years: Marcus Vance. Senior Investigator, Department of Labor. Elias looked at the rusted sedan Beatrice had mocked. It was a humble car, but it was paid for, and more importantly, it was invisible, just like him. He dialed the number. "Marcus, it's Elias Thorne. I have a lead for you. It's a bakery. And Marcus, bring the heavy hitters. This one is going to be a bloodbath." 3 hours after the brass bell of the bakery had ceased its frantic jangling, the air in the Thorne apartment smelled of lavender-scented burn cream and the metallic tang of a struggling radiator. Elias Thorne sat at the small, scarred kitchen table, his eyes fixed on his daughter. Sophie sat across from him, her slender shoulders hunched as she stared at her hands. The gauze he had just applied was stark white against her pale skin, covering the angry, weeping blisters she'd earned from the unshielded oven racks Beatrice Vane refused to repair. The silence was punctuated only by the rhythmic, hollow clacking of the pipes. It was a humble sound, one that usually brought Elias a sense of quietude, but tonight it felt like a countdown. He reached out, his thumb tracing the edge of the table. He could still feel the phantom vibration of the phone call he'd made to Marcus Vance. The wheels were turning now, heavy and inexorable, but the immediate sting of the present was still sharp. His phone buzzed against the wood, a harsh, jarring sound. He didn't need to see the caller ID to know who it was. The Vane sisters moved in a coordinated pack, and if Beatrice was the teeth, Cassandra Vane was the venom. He answered on the 3rd ring. He didn't say hello. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Cassandra's voice was a sharp blade, honed by years of unearned privilege. In the background, Elias could hear the clink of ice against crystal and the muffled, upbeat tempo of a jazz record, the sounds of a life bought with other people's sweat. "Beatrice is in tears, Elias. She had to throw out 3 batches of artisan sourdough because you decided to have a tantrum and walk out." "Sophie was injured, Cassandra," he said, his voice a low, dangerous simmer. He looked at his daughter, who winced at the sound of her aunt's name. "She has 2nd-degree burns because the safety housing on the industrial oven is gone." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Cassandra snapped. "It's a kitchen, not a playground. Burns are part of the trade. If the girl is too fragile for the work, that's a reflection on your parenting, not the equipment. Beatrice was doing you a favor by giving her a job at all. We're family, Elias, but there's a limit to how much of your incompetence we can subsidize." Elias felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, a cold, calculated rage that he had spent years masking behind a veneer of boring middle management compliance. "Subsidize?" "Yes," she hissed. And since you cost the business nearly $500 in wasted product and lost labor today, Beatrice is deducting it from your sisterly allowance this month. Consider it a lesson in accountability. Don't bother coming in tomorrow or the day after. Beatrice says she needs reliable people for the Sterling account. The Sterling garden party, Elias said softly. In 3 days. Exactly. Juliana Sterling is the gateway to the city's elite. If this goes well, the bakery is looking at a permanent contract. Not that you'd understand the stakes. Just stay in your little apartment and try not to break anything else. The line went dead. Elias slowly lowered the phone. He felt the cold, smooth plastic in his grip, a stark contrast to the boiling indignation in his gut. He looked at Sophie, who was watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. "She said I was clumsy, didn't she?" Sophie whispered. "No, Sophie," he said, his voice regaining its unnatural, professional calm. "She said something much more useful." He stood up and walked to the corner of the room, where a nondescript black laptop bag sat on a chair. He pulled out the machine, a high-end workstation that looked entirely out of place in the modest room. With a few practiced keystrokes, he bypassed the basic login and entered a secure, encrypted partition. The screen glowed, reflecting in his glasses. He wasn't looking at recipes or shift schedules anymore. He was looking at the back-end payroll server for the bakery, a system he had helped Beatrice set up 3 years ago. She thought it was just a way to track flour and sugar. She didn't realize he had built a mirror of every transaction, every off-the-books cash payment, and every diverted tax filing. His fingers danced across the keys. He pulled up the Sterling contract. It was massive, a 5-figure deposit already sitting in an offshore account Beatrice thought was invisible. He watched the numbers scroll by, a digital trail of greed and labor violations that stretched back years. He clicked a single icon, an outgoing transfer of data. "What are you doing, Dad?" Sophie asked. Elias didn't look up. He watched the progress bar hit 90%. "I'm just doing a final audit, Sophie. Your Aunt Beatrice always said I was too focused on the small details." The bar hit 100%. The data was now in the hands of Marcus Vance and the forensic team at the Department of Labor. 3 days, Elias murmured, the blue light of the screen casting long, sharp shadows against the wall. "The Sterling party is in 3 days, and I think it's time we showed Juliana Sterling exactly what she's been paying for." He closed the laptop with a soft, final click. The countdown had begun, and for the first time in a decade, the sleeping lion wasn't just awake, he was hungry. 2 days later, the morning air in Marcus Vance's office was thick with the scent of hot ink and stale coffee. The low, rhythmic thrum of a high-speed laser printer provided the only soundtrack to a silence that felt heavy with impending judgment. Elias Thorne sat in a low-slung leather chair, his eyes fixed on the progress bar of a laptop. He didn't look like a man about to dismantle a legacy. He looked like a weary father who had spent too many nights staring at spreadsheets. Marcus leaned against the edge of his mahogany desk, crossing his arms. He watched the final pages slide into the tray with a crisp, metallic snap. He picked up the top sheet, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers that Elias had meticulously unearthed. After a moment, he let out a low whistle that cut through the hum of the office. "I've seen a lot of creative accounting in this department, Elias," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "But this isn't just greed, it's systematic. Beatrice Vane hasn't just been underpaying her staff. She's been skimming from the pension fund and filing fraudulent tax credits for family apprenticeships that don't exist. She's been using Sophie's name to claim labor subsidies." Elias felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. He reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth, white paper of the report. It felt like a weapon. "She thought she was being clever. She thought because I was just an auditor for a mid-sized firm, I wouldn't notice the discrepancies in the family trust. She underestimated how much I pay attention to the small things." "The Department of Labor is going to have a field day with this," Marcus continued, tapping the folder. "The moment this goes live, her business licenses are frozen. But you said you wanted a specific timeline." "The Sterling party is in 24 hours, Elias said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. Juliana Sterling is the primary benefactor for the local heritage Grant Beatrice is counting on to expand. If Juliana sees this before the ink is dry on that contract, the expansion dies. And without that grant, the debt Beatrice has hidden will collapse the bakery within a month. Before Marcus could respond, Elias' phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID flashed a name that made his jaw tighten: Beatrice Vane. He signaled Marcus to be silent and hit the speakerphone. "Elias, are you there? I don't have all day." Beatrice's voice boomed through the office, shrill and dripping with a practiced, condescending impatience. "I'm here, Beatrice," he replied quietly. "Good. Listen, I've decided to be generous. I'm hosting a pre-party brunch tomorrow morning before we head to the Sterling estate. I need Sophie there at 6:00 a.m. She needs to help with the catering displays. And tell her to wear something professional for once, not those rags she usually drags around. Cassandra is bringing a photographer for a family success feature in the local Gazette, and we can't have your daughter looking like a charity case in the background." In the background, Elias heard a sharp, melodic laugh. It was Cassandra Vane. "Oh, Beatrice, don't be so hard on them," she chimed in, her voice buzzing with an artificial sweetness that set Elias' teeth on edge. "Maybe we can find one of my old dresses from 3 seasons ago for her. It'll still be the most expensive thing she's ever touched. It's important for the help to look presentable, even if they are family." Elias gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles turning a stark, ghostly white. The audacity of their entitlement was a physical weight in the room. They weren't just exploiting his daughter, they were narrating her humiliation as if it were a service they were providing. "She won't be there at 6:00 a.m., Beatrice," Elias said, his voice devoid of emotion. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Excuse me," Beatrice finally hissed. "After everything I've done for you, after I gave that girl a job when nobody else would look at her, you're going to be difficult now. Do you have any idea who I am in this town? I am the reason people even know the Thorne name. You're a footnote, Elias. A boring, gray little man who counts other people's money because he can't make any of his own." "I know exactly who you are," he said, his gaze meeting Marcus's. Marcus was already nodding, a grim smile touching his lips. "And I know exactly what you've done. We'll see you at the Sterling party tomorrow evening, Beatrice. I think it's going to be a very enlightening night for everyone." "Don't you dare use that tone with me," she snapped. "You'll be lucky if I even let you through the gates. Juliana invited *me*. You're just a +1 to your own family's success. Don't forget your place." She hung up before he could respond. The dial tone hummed, a lonely sound in the large office. Elias slowly lowered the phone. The rage was there, a dull roar in his ears, but beneath it was a profound, icy clarity. "She has no idea," Marcus murmured, sliding a sleek black flash drive across the desk toward Elias. "Everything is on here. The digital trail, the scanned signatures, the offshore transfers. It's all encrypted. One password and the entire house of cards falls." Elias picked up the drive. It was small, cold, and heavy. He tucked it into his inner coat pocket, right over his heart. "She's so blinded by the glare of her own ego that she can't see the shadow she's standing in." He stood up, smoothing his jacket. He felt a strange sense of peace. The preparation was over. The evidence was secured. He thought of Sophie, who was currently at home, finally resting after a week of 12-hour shifts she was never paid for. He thought of the way she had looked at her blistered hands that morning, trying to hide them from him. 24 hours, Elias whispered. "What's the password?" Marcus asked as Elias walked toward the door. Elias paused, his hand on the brass handle. He looked back, a shadow of a smile playing on his lips, the first real smile he had felt in years. "Audit," he said. He stepped out into the hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. He wasn't just a boring man counting money anymore. He was the man holding the bill, and tomorrow he was going to make sure Beatrice Vane paid every last cent. The countdown had reached its final cycle, and as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Elias Thorne felt the hunger of the lion finally begin to sharpen into a lethal, quiet focus. The day before the Juliana Sterling gala, the air inside Vane's artisanal bakery was a suffocating blend of yeast and Beatrice Vane's screeching. She stood in the center of the kitchen, her face a blotchy red that clashed with her designer silk scarf. "Move faster!" she barked at a trembling junior baker who was struggling to pipe ganache onto a mountain of tarts. "If Juliana Sterling smells even a hint of incompetence tomorrow, I'll have your wages for the next month to cover the loss of my reputation." Elias Thorne watched from the doorway, his coat draped over one arm. He looked like the same unremarkable man he had been for years, but his spine felt as though it were forged from tempered steel. He watched her snatch a tray of petits fours from the counter, the metal screeching against the stainless steel, nearly clipping the worker's shoulder. "Beatrice," he said, his voice low but cutting through the clatter of baking sheets. She turned, her eyes narrowing as she took him in. "Oh, it's you. I don't have time for family charity today, Elias. Sophie is in the back scrub-washing the industrial cooling racks. Make sure she doesn't miss the corners this time. I'm not paying her to daydream, even if she is your daughter." Elias didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold, hard edge of the flash drive Marcus had encrypted for him. That small piece of plastic held the digital ghost of every stolen hour, every unpaid shift, and every forged signature she had ever penned. The smell of expensive vanilla extract, the kind she bragged about to customers but rarely used in the actual dough, clung to her like a shield. "I didn't come here to talk about Sophie's shifts," he replied, stepping further into the flour-dusted room. "I came to give you a piece of advice." Beatrice let out a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed off the industrial mixers. She leaned against a marble prep table, crossing her arms over her chest. "Advice? From a man who spends his life squinting at spreadsheets in a cubicle. Please, unless you're here to tell me how to hide more of my profits from the taxman, I'm not interested." "Success is a fragile thing," Elias said, his tone conversational, almost gentle. "Sometimes the things we think are buried the deepest have a way of surfacing when the lights are the brightest. You should be careful with the records for the Sterling account. Audits have a way of finding the gaps you think you've filled." Beatrice's sneer didn't waver. "Spare me the fortune cookie philosophy. Tomorrow night is my coronation. Juliana Sterling is personally introducing me as the new face of the city's culinary elite. While you're sitting at home counting your pennies, I'll be signing a contract that will make this little shop look like a lemonade stand." She stepped closer, her perfume, something floral and cloying, invading his space. "You're just jealous. You've always been the steady one, which is just a nice word for failure. Now get out. You're getting dust on my floor." As he turned to leave, the chime above the door rang. Juliana Sterling stepped inside, her presence immediately draining the oxygen from the room. She was draped in a charcoal wool coat that screamed old money, her eyes scanning the kitchen with a practiced, predatory grace. Beatrice's demeanor shifted instantly. Her spine curved into a submissive bow, her voice turning into a sugary trill. "Juliana, you're early. We were just finalizing the centerpieces for the gala." Juliana didn't look at the centerpieces. Her gaze landed on Elias. She paused, her brow furrowing slightly. She had met him once before at a charity auction where he had faded into the wallpaper. But today, the man standing by the exit didn't look like wallpaper. He stood with a quiet, terrifying confidence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Mr. Thorne?" Juliana asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "I didn't realize you were associated with this establishment." "Just family, Mrs. Sterling," Elias said. He offered a small, polite nod, not the frantic bowing Beatrice was performing. "I was just telling my sister-in-law to prepare for a very memorable evening. I'm sure everything will come to light exactly as it should." Juliana's eyes lingered on him for a second too long, her intuition sensing a shift in the atmosphere she couldn't quite name. "I'm looking forward to it," she said slowly. Elias stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving Beatrice to flutter around her benefactor like a desperate moth. He checked his watch. 22 hours. He could almost hear the ticking of the clock in his head, a rhythmic, relentless sound that matched the steady beating of his heart. Back at his small apartment, he sat at the kitchen table in the dark. He didn't need the lights. He just watched the city's skyline, the lights of the high-rises reflecting in the window like distant, cold stars. Tomorrow, the sugar coating would melt away. Tomorrow, the lion would stop sleeping. He picked up his phone and sent a one-word text to Marcus Vance. Ready. The evening of the Vane Bakery 10th anniversary gala arrived with a heavy, expectant stillness that seemed to vibrate through the marble floors of the Sterling estate. The air inside the grand ballroom was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of over 1,000 white lilies, a fragrance so aggressive it felt like a physical weight. Crystal chandeliers hummed with low-voltage electricity, casting a sharp, unforgiving light over the assembly of local elite and social climbers. Beatrice Vane stood at the center of the room, a shimmering vision in emerald silk that likely cost more than Elias Thorne earned in a quarter. She held court with the practiced ease of a monarch, her laughter ringing out like breaking glass whenever a guest offered a compliment. Beside her, Cassandra Vane preened, her neck draped in diamonds that caught the light with every theatrical toss of her head. They looked like the very definition of success, built on a foundation of stolen wages and the exploited labor of a 14-year-old girl. Elias entered the room exactly 10 minutes after the official start time. He didn't slink in. He didn't try to hide the fact that his suit, while clean and perfectly pressed, was a 5-year-old off-the-rack charcoal number that had seen better days. He felt the shift in the room's temperature the moment Beatrice spotted him. She didn't even wait for him to reach the inner circle before she launched her first volley. "Oh, Elias," she said, her voice carrying easily over the soft string quartet playing in the corner. She didn't move toward him. She waited for him to come to her, forcing him to walk the gauntlet of curious stares. "I specifically told Cassandra you'd probably be too tired after your busy week of filing papers to make it. I'm surprised you found something in your closet that didn't have mothballs on it." A few of the surrounding guests chuckled, a sycophantic hollow sound. Cassandra smirked, sipping from a flute of vintage champagne. "Be nice, Bea. It's hard to keep up with the dress code when you're living on a public servant's pittance." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't let the heat of embarrassment rise to his cheeks. Instead, he felt a cold, crystalline clarity. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool, brushed metal of the flash drive Marcus Vance had cleared for use. The weight of it was a comfort, a silent promise of the storm to come. "The invitation said semi-formal, Beatrice," he said, his voice level and devoid of the stuttering apology she clearly expected. "I wouldn't want to upstage the woman of the hour." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. She didn't like the lack of a reaction. She thrived on the flinch, the lowered gaze, the stammered excuse. Seeing him stand there, looking her directly in the eye with a faint, unreadable smile, seemed to grate on her nerves like a dull blade. "Well, since you're here, try not to linger near the buffet," she snapped, turning her back on him to address a group of investors. "We have actual dignitaries arriving, and I'd prefer the staff didn't mistake you for someone looking for a handout." Elias moved away, his gaze scanning the room. He spotted Juliana Sterling near the tall French doors, looking regal in navy lace. She was the gatekeeper of this world, and Beatrice was desperate for her seal of approval. Juliana's eyes met his for a fraction of a second, a sharp, discerning look that suggested she saw far more than the emerald silk and diamonds on display. He felt a hand on his shoulder. Marcus Vance stood there, looking every bit the high-ranking official in a bespoke tuxedo. He didn't look at Elias. He looked out at the crowd, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. "Everything is in position," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the music. "The technicians have the feed ready. The moment she starts her speech, the link goes live." "Is the labor board representative here?" Elias asked, his eyes following Beatrice as she moved toward the stage at the front of the room. "Standing by in the foyer with the injunction," Marcus confirmed. "She has no idea, Elias. She's actually going to brag about the family values of her business model." The irony tasted like copper in Elias' mouth. He thought of Sophie, back at the apartment, finally sleeping without the weight of flour dust in her lungs or the fear of her aunt's screaming fits. He thought of the ledger in his bag, the one that proved Beatrice had been skimming from the employee pension, fund to pay for the very diamonds Cassandra was currently flaunting. The evening progressed with a calculated, agonizing slowness. Elias played the role of the invisible relative, drifting through the shadows of the ballroom. He watched as Beatrice grew more emboldened by the wine and the adulation. She was at her peak, her arrogance inflating with every toast. At one point, she caught him near the dessert table. She marched over, her face flushed with a toxic mix of alcohol and triumph. She grabbed a half-empty glass of red wine from a passing waiter and thrust it toward Elias. "Here," she hissed, her voice low so Juliana, who was 10 feet away, wouldn't hear the venom. "Be useful for once. Someone spilled something near the podium. Go find a cloth and clean it up before I head up there. I won't have my moment ruined by a smudge." Elias looked at the glass, then at her. He could see the fine lines of cruelty around her mouth, the utter conviction that he was nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. "I think you can handle a smudge, Beatrice," he said softly. "You've spent years covering up much larger messes than that." Her hand shook, the wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim of the glass. "You pathetic, ungrateful little man. Do you have any idea what I've done for this family? I kept you and that brat of yours afloat when no one else would. You owe me everything." "I know exactly what you've done," Elias replied, his voice a calm anchor in the sea of her rising rage. "And I think the guests are about to find out, too." Beatrice scoffed, a jagged, ugly sound. "What are you going to do? Audit me? Go ahead. My books are perfect. I have the best accountants money can buy." "Money can buy a lot of things, Beatrice," Elias said, stepping back as the lights in the ballroom began to dim. "But it can't buy silence forever." He turned and walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing there with the wine glass trembling in her hand. He moved toward the back of the room, where the AV booth was tucked behind a velvet curtain. He checked his watch. The countdown in his head hit 0. At the front of the room, the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone. The room went silent, the clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversation dying away as all eyes turned toward the stage. Beatrice Vane smoothed her dress, a predatory smile fixed on her face as she prepared to step into the spotlight. She looked toward Juliana Sterling, seeking that final nod of validation. Elias leaned against the cool stone of the pillar at the back of the hall. He reached into his pocket one last time, feeling the flash drive. He didn't need to see the screen to know what was about to happen. He knew every line of the evidence. He knew every recorded scream, every forged signature, every cent of stolen money. Beatrice stepped onto the podium, the spotlight hitting her with a blinding, white intensity. She leaned into the microphone, her voice amplified and echoing through the hall. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her tone dripping with a faux humility that made Elia's skin crawl. "Tonight isn't just about a bakery. It's about a legacy. It's about the sacrifices we make for the people we love." Elias saw the technician in the booth give him a sharp, final nod. He didn't look away. He watched Beatrice's face, illuminated and arrogant, as the large projector screen behind her flickered to life. "I've always believed," Beatrice continued, her eyes sweeping the room, "that the truth always finds its way to the light." Elias felt a cold shiver of anticipation. "You have no idea, Beatrice," he whispered to the empty air. "You have no idea." The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the lungs of every socialite and city official present. Beatrice Vane stood frozen on the podium, her hand still raised in a graceful gesture of triumph that had suddenly transformed into a jagged silhouette of arrogance. Behind her, the massive projector screen no longer displayed the elegant, Vane heritage, logo, or the artisanal bread she had promised to the city's elite. Instead, a grainy, high-definition video filled the space, the audio echoing off the marble walls with a brutal, unforgiving clarity. "You're a parasite, Sophie," the recorded voice of Beatrice Vane sneered, the sound stripped of its public honey and replaced with a terrifying, sharp-edged venom. On the screen, the 14-year-old girl cowered in the bakery's cramped, windowless office, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "You'll work the double shift, and you'll sign these logs saying you were paid. Your family is free labor. If you tell your father, I'll make sure he loses that pathetic auditing job. Do you understand me?" A collective gasp rippled through the audience, a wave of genuine shock that tasted like ozone in the air. Juliana Sterling, the undisputed gatekeeper of the city's social hierarchy, slowly lowered her champagne glass, her eyes narrowing into cold, obsidian slits. Beside her, Marcus Vance didn't move a muscle, but the way his jaw set into a hard line of professional steel suggested a predator who had finally found his mark. Cassandra Vane, who had been smirking in the front row just moments ago, suddenly looked as though she wanted to melt into the floorboards, her face flushing a deep, guilty crimson as she realized the cameras had caught her laughing in the background of the recording. Beatrice's transformation was a study in psychological and physical collapse. The calculated, regal tilt of her head vanished, replaced by a frantic, jerking motion as she spun toward the screen. The blood didn't just drain from her face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving her skin the color of damp parchment, a sickly gray that made her look 20 years older in an instant. Her carefully applied crimson lipstick now looked like a jagged wound against her sudden pallor. Her jaw went slack, her mouth opening and closing in a series of silent, rhythmic gasps that made her look like a landed fish struggling for oxygen on a dry deck. A single, heavy bead of sweat broke from her hairline, carving a jagged path through her expensive foundation until it hung, trembling, from the tip of her chin, reflecting the harsh, white glare of the stage lights. Her eyes, usually so sharp and predatory, became glazed and unfocused, darting around the room with a wild, animalistic panic, as if searching for an exit that had been permanently sealed. This is a fabrication," she finally shrieked, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wail as she clutched the edges of the podium so hard her knuckles turned white. She turned to the crowd, her eyes landing on Juliana Sterling. "Juliana, surely you don't believe this. It's a disgruntled employee, a deep fake meant to ruin me." Juliana Sterling didn't blink. She didn't offer a single word of comfort. She simply turned her back, a silent, social execution that carried more weight than a prison sentence. The rest of the front row followed her lead in a choreographed wave of expensive silk and wool, shifting their chairs away from the stage. Elias Thorne stepped forward from the shadows of the back buffet line. He looked unremarkable in his off-the-rack suit, his posture humble and his hands tucked into his pockets, yet the entire room seemed to pivot toward him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The hum of the projector was the only competition for his calm, steady tone. "It's not a fake, Beatrice," he said, his voice cutting through her frantic breathing like a scalpel through soft tissue. He walked toward the podium, the sound of his sensible shoes rhythmic and steady on the stone floor. "I've spent 6 months tracking the digital signatures on those payroll waivers. You didn't just exploit Sophie. You embezzled from the very heritage you're bragging about tonight. Marcus Vance has the warrants in his pocket. The labor board has the original recordings." He stopped just below the stage, looking up at her not with anger, but with a terrifying, clinical detachment. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, silver thumb drive, holding it up so the light caught the metal. "You told me once that people like me don't belong in your world," Elias Thorne said, his voice a low, steady hum that carried to the very back of the hall. "You were right. I don't belong in a world built on the backs of children and stolen wages. But here's the thing about forensic audits, Beatrice. They always find the rot." He placed the drive on the edge of the stage and turned his back on her. He didn't wait for her to scream, and he didn't stay to watch the security guards begin their ascent to the podium. Elias walked toward the exit, his heart light for the first time in years. He had a daughter to take home, and a lion's work was finally done. Behind him, the first sob of a ruined woman echoed through the hall, but he didn't look back. The silence that followed the heavy thud of the oak doors was more deafening than the speech Elias Thorne had just delivered. In the grand hall, the air remained thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the cooling projector. Beatrice Vane stood paralyzed on the stage, her hand hovering inches from the silver thumb drive he had left behind like a ticking bomb. Her chest heaved beneath her midnight blue silk bodice, the fabric straining with every shallow, panicked breath. She looked out at the sea of faces, the donors, the city council members, the very people she had spent a decade courting, and saw only a wall of cold, unblinking judgment. "It's a lie," she finally choked out, her voice cracking like dry parchment. She grabbed the drive, her knuckles white and trembling. "He's a disgruntled former relative. This is a fabrication, a pathetic attempt to smear a successful woman." She looked toward the VIP table, her eyes searching for her sister. "Cassandra, tell them how he's always been jealous of my success." Cassandra Vane didn't stand. She didn't even look up. Instead, she meticulously smoothed a linen napkin over her lap, her face a mask of practiced indifference. She had seen the numbers on the screen before the projector flickered off, and she knew a sinking ship when she smelled the salt water. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about your accounting practices, Beatrice," she said, her voice cool and distant, carrying easily through the quiet room. "I only ever handled the marketing, if there was discrepancy. I was as much a victim of your secrecy as anyone else." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was the sound of a social circle closing its ranks, and Beatrice was on the outside. Marcus Vance stepped from the shadows of the wings, his suit sharp and his expression even sharper. He didn't look like a guest anymore. He looked like the high-ranking official he was. "Actually, Ms. Vane, the Labor Board has been looking for that specific rot for 18 months, he said, walking toward the podium with a measured, predatory gait. "Mr. Thorne didn't fabricate anything. He simply finished the audit we started, and I believe you'll find the digital signatures on those files are quite indisputable." Beatrice's face didn't just fall, it disintegrated. The carefully applied foundation seemed to settle into the deep lines of a sudden, visceral aging. Her eyes, usually sharp with calculation, became glassy and unfocused, darting frantically like trapped birds. The vibrant flush of her anger drained away, leaving behind a sallow, gray pallor that made her look brittle. Her lower lip began a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch, and for a moment, the poised queen of the culinary scene looked like a hollowed-out shell. Her jaw hung slack, her mouth a jagged, silent O of disbelief, as the weight of her impending ruin physically pulled at her features. The high color in her cheeks vanished instantly, replaced by a sickly, curdled gray that made her look 20 years older in the span of a single heartbeat. A fine sheen of cold sweat broke out across her forehead, matting her perfectly coiffed hair as her composure didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Juliana Sterling stood up, her pearls clicking softly in the tomb-like silence. She didn't look at the stage. She simply turned to the waiter standing by the champagne tower. "Please remove my name from the Vane Bakery gala list," she said, her voice dripping with a polite, lethal disdain. "And cancel my standing order for the charity auction. I find the taste of exploitation bitter." Beatrice let out a strangled sound, half sob and half shriek, and bolted from the stage. She ignored the camera flashes from the local press and the disgusted whispers of her former friends. She tore through the side exit, her heels clicking frantically on the asphalt of the parking lot. She found him by the curb. Elias Thorne was leaning against his modest sedan, the engine already idling. He was watching the city lights, his expression as calm as a frozen lake. "You think you've won?" Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the venue. She stopped 10 feet away, her hair coming loose from its pins. "I will sue you into the dirt. I will tell the world you're a thief. I'll make sure Sophie never gets into a decent school. I'll tell everyone what a pathetic, boring little man you are." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even turn his head. He reached into the car and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. The one he'd used to track every hour Sophie had worked without pay, every cent Beatrice had skimmed from the staff's tips. "The labor board already has the original," Elias said, his voice a low, steady hum that cut through her hysterics. "The IRS has the digital copies, and the press, they have the story of the year." He finally looked at her, and for the first time, the boring auditor looked like the man who had dismantled 3 Fortune 500 companies before he was 30. "You told me I didn't belong in your world, Beatrice. You were right. I belong in a world of facts, and the fact is you're bankrupt. Socially, morally, and by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, financially. You can't do this to family," she wailed, her hands clawing at the air. "Family protects their own," Elias replied, his voice turning to ice. "You exploited a 14-year-old girl because you thought she was too weak to fight back. You didn't realize she had a father who counts for a living." He stepped into the car and closed the door. The sound was final, a sharp click that punctuated the end of her reign. Beatrice stood alone under the flickering orange glow of a street lamp, the smell of exhaust fumes and damp pavement rising around her. Behind her, the doors of the hall opened, and the first of the guests began to stream out, their faces turned away from her as if she were already a ghost. Elias didn't look in the rearview mirror as he pulled away. He had a daughter waiting at home, and for the first time in a long time, the air in the car felt clean. He reached over and turned on the radio, a soft jazz melody filling the cabin, drowning out the distant, fading sound of a ruined woman screaming at the moon. 6 months later, the morning sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the new executive suite, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished mahogany of the desk. Elias Thorne sat in a chair that didn't creak, in an office that didn't smell of damp basement files and forgotten coffee. The air here was filtered and cool, carrying the faint, crisp scent of expensive stationery and the subtle perfume of the white lilies Juliana Sterling sent every Monday morning. He adjusted his watch, a modest but precise timepiece, and looked at the digital clock on his computer. It was 9:00 a.m. The door opened with a soft, heavy click. Marcus Vance stepped inside, looking every bit the victorious architect of a legal massacre. He carried a single manila folder, which he dropped onto the desk with a satisfying thud. "It's over, Elias," he said, his voice holding a note of grim professional respect. "The final liquidation of Vane's artisanal bake shop was completed at dawn. The creditors took the ovens, the display cases, and even the gold leaf signage she was so proud of. There's nothing left but the lease, and that was picked up by a local nonprofit yesterday." Elias didn't smile. He felt a deep, quiet settling in his chest, like a heavy weight finally being lowered into place. And the woman herself. "Beatrice Vane is currently residing in a 400-square-foot basement apartment on the edge of the industrial district," Marcus replied, leaning back in the guest chair. "She's working the early shift at a commercial bread factory, 12 hours a day on her feet, wearing a hairnet and a polyester uniform. I'm told she tried to demand a managerial position on her first day. They laughed her back to the assembly line." Elias leaned forward, his fingers interlaced. He pictured her there, the woman who had once treated her own niece like a servant, now standing in the heat and noise of a factory, surrounded by the very common people she had spent a lifetime mocking. The irony wasn't just poetic, it was mathematical. She had stolen labor and dignity. Now she was paying it back in sweat and anonymity. "She called the office yesterday," Marcus added, his eyes narrowing. "She wanted to know if you'd consider a family settlement." She sounded different. The arrogance is gone, replaced by a sort of frantic, high-pitched desperation. She's realizing that Juliana's social circle doesn't just exclude her, they've forgotten she ever existed. "I have no sister," Elias said, his voice as cold and flat as the marble floors in the lobby below. "And Sophie has no aunt. Tell her the settlement was reached the night I walked out of that ballroom. She's exactly where she earned the right to be." Despite the victory, a shadow flickered across his face. The cost of the war was visible in the silence that followed. He had won, but the Thorne family tree was now a jagged stump. Cassandra Vane had fled the state 3 months ago, unable to face the whispers that followed her every time she stepped into a grocery store. She had been the enabler, the one who watched her brother's daughter be exploited and chose to sip champagne instead of speaking up. Now she was a ghost in a new city, her reputation a scorched earth ruin. Later that afternoon, Elias left the office early. He drove a car that started every time, a reliable silver sedan that didn't rattle when it hit 40 miles per hour. He pulled up to the curb of the city's premier youth art conservatory. Sophie Thorne was waiting on the steps. She looked taller, her shoulders back, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a vibrant, focused energy. She held a portfolio under her arm, her fingers stained with charcoal and cobalt blue. When she saw the car, a genuine, effortless smile broke across her face, a sight that Elias realized was worth every bridge he had burned. "How was the master class?" he asked as she climbed into the passenger seat. "The instructor said my perspective is unique," she said, her voice bright. "He said I see the structure of things, not just the surface." "That's a Thorne trait," Elias said softly, pulling away from the curb. They drove past the old neighborhood, the route taking them near the street where the bakery used to stand. The Vane sign was gone. In its place was a bright, simple banner for a community kitchen. Elias didn't slow down. He didn't need to look. "Dad," Sophie asked, looking out the window as the industrial district blurred past, "do you ever regret it? Everything that happened with Aunt Beatrice?" Elias looked at his daughter, seeing the girl who had been forced to work until her hands bled, the girl who had been told she was worth less than a designer handbag. He thought of the empty seat at Thanksgiving, the silence from his sister, and the cold, hard reality of justice. "I regret that it was necessary," Elias replied, his grip steady on the wheel. "But I don't regret the result. Some things have to be broken before they can be made right." He turned the car toward the park where the trees were beginning to turn gold. The air in the car was clean, the silence between them comfortable and earned. He had been a sleeping lion for 14 years, and while the world now knew his teeth, he was content to let the fire fade. The debt was paid. The books were balanced. And for the first time in his life, Elias Thorne wasn't looking for a discrepancy. He was just going home.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.